When Jonathan Reed decided to trade lives with a homeless man, he never imagined that this move would lead to the complete unraveling of his world. Mark vanished, leaving behind chaos, betrayal, and the loss of everything Jonathan held dear. The events that followed would shock even those who had seen it all. But let's start at the beginning. Jonathan Reed, a successful millionaire and owner of several large companies, started each day the same way. Waking up in a massive bed with the softest sheets, he would slowly lift his head and gaze out the window at the majestic view of his mansion, surrounded by lush gardens. Outside, luxury greeted him at every turn. Pristine lawns, a shimmering pool, expensive cars parked by the gates. It was all his, symbols of the success he had built over many years. Yet something inside him felt wrong. Despite the luxury and status that made him one of the most influential people in the country, Jonathan felt an odd emptiness. Day after day, his life seemed mechanical. He woke up, followed a schedule, attended meetings, signed documents, closed deals, smiled at business dinners with powerful partners, and returned to his empty house. Each day he performed these rituals, but with each new morning, happiness seemed to slip further away from him. The routine of a successful businessman was starting to weigh on him. He had achieved everything one could wish for: companies, money, recognition. But with every new contract, with every million added to his account, the sense of satisfaction never came. An inner voice whispered that there was something important he had missed, but Jonathan couldn't figure out what it was. The money that once brought him joy now seemed like hollow numbers. His achievements no longer inspired him, and his personal relationships, if they could even be called that, brought him no happiness. One evening, returning from yet another glamorous event where millions and new deals were discussed, Jonathan was riding in his limousine through the city center. His gaze casually lingered on the sidewalk outside the expensive restaurant where he often dined with partners. There, amidst the sparkling storefronts and luxury cars, sat a homeless man on the dirty asphalt. His face was lined with wrinkles, his hair was tangled, and his clothes were torn and dirty. Yet something about this man made Jonathan look closer. The homeless man sat motionless, leaning against the building as if he didn't notice the bustling life around him. Cars sped by, people hurried past, neon lights flickered. But in this man's eyes, despite his pitiful condition, there was a strange spark, almost as if he knew something none of the passers-by did. That spark of life, which Jonathan hadn't felt in himself for a long time. Stopping the car, the millionaire watched the homeless man for a while longer, trying to understand what had affected him so deeply. This person, who had nothing, seemed at peace with himself, while Jonathan, who had everything, felt a constant inner struggle. That night he couldn't shake the image from his mind. A man whose life, despite all its hardships, seemed simpler and perhaps fuller than his own. After that night, Jonathan couldn't stop thinking about the homeless man. His mind was consumed by a strange idea. Over and over, he thought back to the man on the sidewalk, his calmness, and the hidden wisdom Jonathan couldn't quite explain. Finally, as if giving in to an inner impulse, he decided something had to change. He needed to experience this man's life to understand what lay behind that peaceful gaze. The next morning, still half embarrassed by his own idea, Jonathan returned to the same spot by the restaurant. The homeless man seemed not to have moved since Jonathan had last seen him. The millionaire hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, and without waiting for a reaction, he spoke first. "Hi, I saw you yesterday. I need your help." The homeless man squinted slightly at Jonathan and smirked, as if finding something amusing about the rich man's face. "Go ahead, talk," he replied lazily, without taking his hands out of the pockets of his tattered coat. Jonathan took a deep breath, preparing to say something that sounded so absurd he could hardly believe it himself. "Let's switch places for one day. You'll be me, and I'll be you. I'll try living your day, and you'll live mine." When the homeless man, whose name was Mark, heard these words, he burst out laughing. It seemed like Jonathan was simply entertaining himself, playing some strange game out of boredom. But as he looked into Jonathan's eyes, the laughter slowly faded. There wasn't even a hint of a joke. Before him stood a man who genuinely needed something more than just money and success. Mark, squinting his eyes, asked, "Are you serious?" "Absolutely," Jonathan replied firmly. "One day. We'll swap clothes, you'll take my day, and I'll take yours. You'll live like a millionaire, and I'll live like you. What do you say?" Mark crossed his arms and thought for a moment. He had spent many years on the streets, accustomed to hardship and the daily struggle for survival, and honestly, the offer sounded like an opportunity that didn't come often. Why not give it a try? After all, he had already lost everything, and the chance to live, even for just one day, as a millionaire was tempting. Finally, with a slight grin, he nodded. Deal. And so began this strange game. The next morning, Mark donned Jonathan's expensive suit, a refined jacket that seemed to belong only to people of high society. For a moment, Mark felt like someone else, a person living in a world where he didn't have to worry about food or shelter. He took Jonathan's luxury car keys and drove to his workplace, where meetings, negotiations, and a host of people awaited, all ready to serve the new boss. But soon, Mark realized that the life of a millionaire wasn't as easy as it seemed. At first, he was captivated by the luxury, the beautiful offices, the respectful employees, the important people around him. However, by midday, Mark felt that something was off. The monotony of business talks and endless meetings started to weigh on him. His head ached from the constant formal conversations, and the piles of paperwork on his desk bored him. What had once seemed like an unattainable dream, a rich life full of opportunities, began to feel like a gilded cage. He was surrounded by luxury, but he didn't feel alive in it. Meanwhile, Jonathan, dressed in Mark's filthy, worn clothes, stepped out onto the street. Each step was filled with unfamiliar feelings of fear and uncertainty. People who had once greeted him with respect now passed by without so much as a glance. Strangers turned away indifferently, pretending he didn't exist. Jonathan felt invisible, as though he had been stripped of everything that made him important. He tried asking a passerby for money, only to be met with a disdainful look and a harsh no. These few hours on the streets taught Jonathan that being poor wasn't just about lacking resources. It was about constantly feeling unwanted. What had once seemed like a simple truth now revealed itself in a new, frightening way. Jonathan could hardly believe how drastically his life had changed in just a few hours. Dressed in Mark's worn and dirty clothes, he felt the cold, indifferent stares of people who once greeted him with smiles and respect. He sat on the sidewalk where he had recently seen the homeless Mark, and for the first time, he understood what it meant to be invisible in a world where money defines everything. Passers-by walked by as if he didn't exist. Occasionally, someone would glance at him with disdain or toss a few coins into the old cup Jonathan held in his hands. But most of the time, people simply ignored him, as though he were part of the street scenery. This was incredibly humiliating for a man who had been used to respect and admiration. Jonathan felt each dismissive glance as a blow to his pride, forcing him to confront his own vulnerability. The longer he remained on the street, the stronger his sense of despair grew. His stomach, gnawing with hunger, reminded him of his need for food more frequently. He tried to stand up and walk around in search of something to eat, but the cold wind cut through him to the bone. Mark's clothes were thin and worn, completely unsuitable for the October chill. Jonathan's fingers began to numb, and his legs trembled from the cold. This was nothing like the comfortable life he had known, where every step had been cushioned by his wealth. Time on the street passed slowly, and with each minute, Jonathan grew increasingly uncomfortable. He began reflecting on his former life, recalling the warm clothes, the restaurants where he could order any dish without thinking about the cost. Now, all he could do was watch passers-by hungrily, hoping for another handout. For the first time, he realized that his wealth had not only brought him comfort, but had also shielded him from the harsh struggles that people like Mark faced every day. Meanwhile, Mark, now dressed in expensive suits and surrounded by successful people, was living an entirely different life. He sat in meetings in luxurious offices, but despite the prestige and respect, he didn't understand a word of what was being discussed. Everything seemed absurd. The topics discussed in these meetings had no meaning for him. He was surrounded by people who didn't respect him for who he was, but for the status he temporarily occupied. Even though Mark didn't know how to conduct negotiations or discuss important financial matters, he enjoyed the respect shown to him. Dining in the finest restaurants where he could choose from the most exquisite dishes, Mark felt like he was on top of the world. Waiters treated him with deference, and colleagues radiated admiration. He rode in luxury cars, watching the city streets where he had spent most of his life from behind tinted windows. But by the end of the day, even Mark began to feel that Jonathan's life had its own challenges. What initially seemed ideal, wealth, privileges, endless opportunities, gradually turned into monotony and crushing responsibility. All the meetings, business discussions, and contracts became a tedious routine. Mark realized that money wasn't a guarantee of happiness. He began to notice that despite the comfort surrounding him, he didn't feel the freedom he had grown accustomed to as a homeless man. These two worlds they had both stepped into for a single day turned out to be far more complex than either of them had imagined. By evening, tired, hungry, and emotionally drained, Jonathan returned to the spot where he and Mark had agreed to meet. Shivering from the cold and exhausted from the emotional toll, he anxiously waited for Mark to show up so that all of this could end and he could return to his normal life. Time passed slowly, and each hour felt like an eternity. Jonathan nervously scanned the crowd, hoping to see the familiar figure, but Mark was nowhere to be seen. With each passing minute, Jonathan's sense of unease grew. After more than 2 hours, he began to realize that something was wrong. Mark hadn't shown up at the agreed-upon time, and this made Jonathan think about the consequences of their deal. What if Mark doesn't come back at all? Flashed through his mind. Jonathan tried to calm himself, reasoning that the homeless man might have just gotten delayed or couldn't find his way back. But deep down, he already sensed that the situation was spiraling out of control. Finally, unable to wait any longer, Jonathan decided to head home, hoping that Mark was already there. He returned to his mansion, greeted by the familiar gates and the grand facade of the house, but the strange feeling of dread didn't leave him. When he entered the house, the atmosphere felt eerie. The usual hum of the staff's activity was absent, and there were no lights in the windows. Jonathan hurried to his office where his computer and important documents were kept. He opened his laptop and immediately checked his bank account. What he saw made his heart race with terror. Huge sums of money had been transferred to unknown accounts. Jonathan panicked as he tried to understand the documents, but everything seemed in order. The transfers were legal, made from his own account, as if he had done it himself. He then checked his business email. Several notifications about completed deals had arrived under his name, all of them important contracts he was supposed to sign the following week, but apparently someone had already done so. The homeless man, who had temporarily become Jonathan, hadn't just enjoyed the privileges of being rich, he had taken full advantage of the opportunity to change Jonathan's life. Mark had signed several major deals that initially seemed profitable, but in reality, caused significant damage to Jonathan's company. Some partners were retracting their offers, while others were demanding explanations for the sudden changes in contractual obligations. Jonathan felt an overwhelming sense of ruin. He couldn't believe what was happening. In just one day, his life had been destroyed. Those who had once admired him and his success now looked at him with confusion and concern. His reputation, built over years, was beginning to crumble before his eyes. Not knowing what to do next, Jonathan tried contacting his assistants and business partners to fix the situation, but it was too late. News of the strange decisions and unpredictable actions taken by Jonathan had already spread throughout his network. Everyone was panicking. People who once relied on his professionalism and confidence were now questioning his sanity and his ability to run his business. And as for Mark, he had vanished, as if into thin air. No traces, no messages. It was at this moment that Jonathan realized the true cost of his impulsive decision. His desire for something more, his quest to understand another life, had led to catastrophic consequences. Jonathan sat in his office, surrounded by documents, letters, and empty computer screens, realizing that his world had begun to fall apart. He hadn't just lost money. He had lost something far more valuable, the trust he had spent years building. It was something intangible, yet crucial to his success and reputation. His partners, employees, and friends, those who had once looked up to him with respect, now saw only disappointment and betrayal. They couldn't understand how a man with so much experience could have made such reckless decisions, ones that harmed not only his business, but their interests as well. All the deals Mark had made in Jonathan's name had thrown everything into chaos. Companies Jonathan had partnered with began severing contracts, banks were freezing accounts, and employees and partners were demanding explanations. But Jonathan had none to give. He was helpless in the face of the fact that one mistake had destroyed his entire life. It was a true shock for someone who had always been in control of every aspect of his existence. The realization that Mark had taken advantage of his trust and status, only to disappear, left Jonathan in total disarray. The homeless man, who had been the temporary master of his life for just one day, had vanished into the shadows of the city, leaving the millionaire to face the consequences alone. Attempts to find Mark were futile. Private investigators, police inquiries, it was all in vain. He wasn't just a missing person. He was a stark reminder of how easy it was to lose everything that had taken years to build. But there was something greater than the financial losses and the damaged reputation. The day Jonathan spent on the streets left a deep mark on his soul. He finally understood that money, status, and comfort were not guarantees of inner happiness or fulfillment. All this time, he had been searching for something more, believing that the answers lay in wealth and success. But after seeing the world through Mark's eyes, he realized that the people he once considered invisible lived by entirely different values. The hunger, the cold, and the disdain he encountered opened his eyes to the harsh reality that thousands of people face every day. Now, sitting in his nearly empty house, Jonathan felt that the foundation his millions had once provided was no longer there. Money had once seemed to solve everything, but that day on the street made him rethink everything he had ever believed. Returning to his old life was impossible. His entire world had changed in a single day, and the lesson remained with him. The quest for something new, the desire to understand life from another perspective, had led to the destruction of everything he had built. What had once seemed like a solid foundation turned out to be fragile and unreliable. Jonathan could no longer live under the illusion that money could protect him from everything. His experiment, the life swap that he had hoped would help him find answers to his internal questions, had led to catastrophic consequences. This experience showed him that sometimes the search for truth and the desire to change one's life can come at too high a price. In the end, Jonathan realized that his internal search for something greater was far more complicated than he had imagined. Perhaps the answers he had been seeking weren't found in material wealth or power. Now, he had to rebuild his life from scratch, with the awareness that the past could never be reclaimed.